Israel passed a piece of legislation in the Knesset this week that some are saying is their most important step in more than 5 decades. On the opposite side, a former Israeli prime minister, who spent time in prison for bribery, by the way, told Britain's Channel 4 that Israel is descending into civil war, even hinting that he would maybe support such a thing. U.S. President Joe Biden said he was disappointed that this piece of legislation passed with such a slim majority of Israel's parliament, even though it received 100% of the votes of the governing coalition. What's actually going on? Let's find out on today's show. I'm Luke, and this is the Israel Guys. Hello and welcome to the Israel Guys, where we believe that in a world of Jew hatred and anti-Israel propaganda, you should have a direct connection to the land and people of Israel. Guys, if you haven't done it yet, please subscribe. Subscribe on YouTube, Rumble, all across social media, podcast platforms, wherever you watch or listen. And let me know down in the comments below if you are a new subscriber. I would love to hear from you. To kick off today's show, let's watch this short 20-second clip from Twitter, rolling now.
The majority of the Israeli population is not behind this particular vote. That's just the truth. But the Israeli people are not going to stop fighting to make sure that Israel stays a liberal democracy, which is strong, safe, and secure.
So something doesn't quite add up here. Noah Tishby is claiming that the majority of Israel's citizens are against the current judicial reforms, but the first phase of those reforms just passed the third reading in the Knesset yesterday, with a majority of 64 votes, by a coalition government that was voted in by the people, in a first world democratic nation. What is going on here? Hang tight, we'll get to it in just a second. U.S. President Joe Biden issued a statement expressing his disappointment that these judicial reform laws were voted in with the, quote, slimmest possible majority. So I guess he's talking about the fact that the law only received 64 votes out of the 120-member Knesset, with the rest of the Knesset members abstaining in protest. Because they didn't get any members of the opposition to support the law, maybe that's why he's disappointed? Well, it's definitely not 2/3 of the Knesset for sure. It did receive the vote of the entire, meaning 100% of the coalition part of the Israel's parliament. For the White House to issue this statement would be similar to a foreign leader saying that they were disappointed that the U.S. House of Representatives or the U.S. Senate passed a piece of legislation with only the votes of every single Democrat or every single Republican who is currently in power. By the way, many of the liberal members of Israel's society, including those in the judiciary branch and those in the Knesset, used to be more pro-judicial reform, even up until Yair Lapid's term in office as early as last year. Unfortunately, those on the left have hated Netanyahu's right-wing conservative coalition so much that they're willing to do anything to take him down, including pretending that they are 100% against any and all judicial reform. If you don't believe that, just look at the fact that the current protests were funded and planned before Bibi's government was sworn into office earlier this year. Some of it actually funded and planned by former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak. Speaking of former prime ministers in Israel, another Ehud Olmert, gave an interview to Britain's Channel 4 in which he claimed that Israel is now going into civil war. Take a look at this clip.
There is a threat. This is a serious threat. Has never happened before. And we are going into civil war now. A civil war between the people. Yeah, I mean, civil disobedience with all the possible ramifications to the stability of the state and to the ability of the government to perform and to the obedience of the large part of the Israeli population to a government which is perceived by a large part of the population to be illegitimate. Government has decided to threaten the foundations of Israel democracy. And this is not something that we can accept or that we can tolerate.
So I definitely have some comments about Ehud Olmert's crazy claim that Israel is actually descending into a civil war. But first, a word from today's sponsor. Have you ever wondered what life is like for children living in Israel's biblical heartland? While kids in most American towns are playing hide and seek with their friends, thousands of children in Judea and Samaria, the so-called West Bank, are suffering every day from the trauma of Islamic terror. After David Rubin and his young son were wounded in a terror attack, David realized that his son was only one of thousands of children in Israel who were suffering physically and psychologically from terror attacks and desperately needed a way to heal. And so he founded the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund to provide victimized children with the life-saving therapies they urgently need to heal from their trauma. Traumatized children are different from adults. They can't sit in a room with a therapist and just talk things out. The Shiloh Israel Children's Fund provides unique programs to help kids work through their trauma in ways that work for them, through art therapy, drama therapy, animal therapy, and so much more. Every child responds to trauma differently, so they tailor these life-changing therapies to each and every child's individual needs. The success that Shiloh Israel Children's Fund has had with these children is incredible and inspiring. They've helped thousands of Israeli kids to contend with the trauma, to find healing, eventually moving forward to live happy, healthy, productive lives. Guys, there are less than 75 days left to the Jewish New Year, and in honor of Israel's 75th birthday, we're determined to save 75 children by Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. Together, let's celebrate this special time of year by saving 75 children to give them the happy and healthy future they so deserve. Guys, go to the link below to see what it takes to save the life of a terror-stricken child in Israel, Biblical's heartland. Thank you so much for your support. Guys, I have a couple of comments about what you may be even hearing the mainstream media headlines, maybe even Christian pastors and leaders, maybe people inside Israel, outside Israel talking about the end of Israeli democracy or the fact that Israel is descending into civil war. I forgot to put this in my notes, but I was thinking about how when President Donald Trump decided to move the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, a lot of his advisors, State Department officials, career people in the United States government were all telling him not to do it. And a lot of them, even security officials, and I think U.S. military personnel were saying civil war could break out, or war could break out in the Middle East. There could be tons of violence, uptick in terrorism. We could see another return to the Intifada. Ultimately, President Trump decided to move forward with moving the embassy to Jerusalem because he knew that recognizing Israel's capital in Jerusalem was the right thing to do. And do you know what happened? There was absolutely nothing. It was quiet. Quiet broke out when he did the right thing by moving Israel's capital to Jerusalem, moving the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem and recognizing Israel's sovereignty in Jerusalem because it was the right thing to do. And often, and this is what we've been seeing in the last 7 months in Israel, you see all this political unrest, right? You see anti-judicial reforms, which actually have turned out to be so many other types of protests happening, anti-occupation protests, the radical government protests, pro-LGBT, just all this stuff, because people are just turning out because they hate Netanyahu's right-wing government, especially because he has some very strong conservative individuals who believe in the Jewish people's right to be in the land of Israel. So right now, Israel passed the third reading of the first part of the judicial reform package. If you want to find out the details of all that, by the way, you can check out my source links. There's some good analysis articles down in the description below. Also, Josiah broke down the judicial reform in yesterday's show, so go back on the Israel Guys and watch his show from yesterday. But these things have passed now, and you have people like Ehud Olmert, who was a former prime minister, by the way, who spent time in prison for bribery. So a lot of the comments on Twitter were actually not so favorable towards him. But he's claiming to Israel's Channel 4 that Israel is actually descending into a civil war. And when the interviewer says, wait, you're saying Israel is in a civil war? He started kind of walking back his statements, and he went on to explain that maybe it's civil disobedience. And he said, quote, a government which is perceived by a large part of the population to be illegitimate. The government has decided to threaten the foundations of Israeli democracy, and this is not something that we can accept or that we can tolerate. So he says, oh, well, maybe it's civil disobedience, but really, is there a difference, civil disobedience and civil war? And he says a large part of the population perceives Israel's government to be illegitimate. Just to remind you, especially American, Western-minded viewers, Israel is a democratic nation. They elected the current government through a democratic process. After 4 failed elections, by the way, that resulted in stalemates, They actually formed a coalition because unlike the United States, Israel has like 15 parties that usually get into the Knesset, and they have to come together, those parties, to form at least 61 seats, so they have a majority, and that forms the coalition in Israel's parliament. So all of this, these parties were voted in by the will of the people, including the Judicial Reform package, which was part of their running message, part of their message to be voted in by the people. So you could say that the majority of Israelis actually voted for the current judicial reforms that are happening. But guess what? People actually planned these protests and even funded them in November and December last year. I did a show about this a couple months ago. Before Israel's government was sworn in, they were sworn in. The next week, the protests started, right? And if you've been following the mainstream media, it would be reasonable maybe to believe that Israel is actually on the brink of civil war or already in civil war, because you're seeing footage of mass protests, tens and hundreds of thousands of people, Israeli police using water cannons on protesters, et cetera, et cetera. And yes, there have been mass protests since the beginning of January, some of them bigger, some of them much smaller than what the media reported. Actually, no, I went to one of the protests. Our team went to 2 different protests. Some of them were way smaller than what the media reported. Some of them were actually fairly large. But what the media will not tell you and will not show you at all is something that might actually shock you. There have been mass protests in support of the judicial reform packages. Just this past Sunday, the day before the third reading, when the first part of the reform was passed into legislation, there was a massive protest in Jerusalem in support of the judicial reforms. So I'm actually not going to make any claims as to the numbers. I'm going to actually show you the photos and the drone footage, and you can form your own opinion. I will say, as we're watching this footage, which if you can look with your own eyes, this drone footage, you could guesstimate. Let me know in the comments, how many people do you think were at this protest? This is not one of the mass protests and demonstrations against Israel's government. This is a mass protest in support of Israel's government and in support of judicial reform. Jewish Breaking News, they said that they reported that there was reports claiming to be 500,000 people in this protest. I saw another claim that said 200,000 people. You guys let me know. What do you think? How many people were at this protest? Obviously, it's not anything small. You can see they filled the streets of Jerusalem. But I guess I say all that to say that there are people out there claiming that the current legislation that just passed through Israel's parliament, their Knesset, does not represent the will of the people. That Israel's government is far too radical, extremist, or right-wing, and that they're not listening to their citizens and other world leaders. You guys should not believe any of it. Because the first part of the judicial reform process in Israel was voted through because the majority of Israelis voted for this government and have showed up in Israel's streets in support of these laws. And again, if you want to know more of the actual details of the judicial reform process, watch yesterday's show with Josiah. He broke it all down. Or check out my source links. JNS had a great article down in the description below. Guys, a couple of other short pieces of news. I was sitting in my front yard this morning. I happened to be up very early and decided to watch the sunrise. Sitting in my front yard a few minutes after 6 a.m., and all of a sudden I heard the loudest gunfire I have ever heard. I started counting the shots, but after 7 or 8, I lost track because they started coming faster and faster and faster. There's probably over 50 shots, live gunfire, over the course of the next 5 minutes. I wasn't too nervous because I know we're close to Nablus, and sometimes you hear gunfire in the distance, either from the refugee camps, sometimes you hear it from Arab-Palestinian weddings, celebrations, and sometimes IDF counterterrorism operations. But this gunfire was extremely, extremely loud. So a couple hours later, the news came out that 3 terrorists opened fire at the IDF at an entrance to Shechem, Nablus, which is just across the hill from where we're located. So this is a story I'm reporting on firsthand for you guys. Thankfully, the IDF was able to neutralize all 3 terrorists who were armed with M16s, pulled up in a vehicle and opened fire on the IDF. And thankfully, no soldiers or anyone else was injured in the process. One other piece of breaking news before we wrap up is that last night, Palestinian terrorists also opened fire at a public Israeli bus near the town of Hawara and Shechem as well. Thankfully, public Israeli buses are all armored and they're bulletproof, so even though there are a few passengers on board, no one was injured, thank God. Yossi Dagan is the chairman of the Shomron Regional Council. He said, quote, "The Israeli government must respond with an iron fist. This kind of terrorism should not be contained. We could have had an attack with several deadly casualties," and obviously he's absolutely right. Guys, I would love to hear what your thoughts are about the legislation that Israel passed through their government down in the comments below. Obviously, it's controversial. There are mixed messages coming out from world leaders, Christian pastors, Messianic believers in Israel all over the world. You guys probably hear it being deluged with a lot of differing opinions. So let me know what you think about in the comments down below. Don't forget to check all of my sources. Guys, please consider supporting the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund and do your part to help victims of terrorism in Israel, specifically children, receive the life-saving therapy that they need. Link is down in the description below. As always, subscribe, get that conversation going down below, and tune out the fake news and tune into what is actually happening here in the land of Israel. We're here every Monday through Friday with your direct connection to the land and people of Israel. Israel's heartland is in trouble. Right now, there are 15 illegal Arab structures being built every day in Judea and Samaria. That's 105 per week, 450 per month, and more than 5,000 every single year. At this moment, there are more than 100,000 illegal Arab houses sitting in Area C, mostly on Israeli state land, taking over Israel's biblical heartland. This illegal secret takeover of Judea and Samaria is well-funded, well-coordinated, and 100% dedicated to creating a terrorist-controlled Palestinian state on Israel's prophetic mountains. What can we do to stop this illegal land takeover? At the Greening Israel Project, we're in the midst of our 10,000 tree summer project to stop the illegal takeover by those who hate Israel. With every tree that is planted in Judea and Samaria, we can do our part to help Israel claim back their homeland. On top of that, planting trees restores the land physically and fulfills biblical prophecy. Go to greeningisrael.com or click the link down in the description below.